take your picture and he will give you the award.
As we did a moment ago with one of our other awardees, we're going to do this as a conversation, and the person who we're honored to have converse with George is Elisa Rosenberg. She's an editor and columnist at the Washington Post's opinion section, where she writes about the intersection of culture and politics. She founded the culture and sports sections at Think Progress. Her work has appeared in many publications, including The Atlantic, State, and the Washington Monthly. She contributed a chapter to Beyond the Wall, a critical examination of George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire.
Well, this is an enormous treat for all of us, and I think especially for me. Thank you so much for being here tonight.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm thrilled to be here.
Our first question is inspired by a question from Gina in the audience, whose father is apparently 6 years older than you and grew up in Bayonne on, let's see, this is Cooper Street between Avenue E and Broadway. So we're going to start very hyper-local. You've spoken and written a great deal about the importance of imagination in transporting you beyond the Bayonne neighborhood where you grew up. And in a 1981 speech you said, and I want to quote this because I think it's perfect, you told the audience, the way to start a little would-be writer is first bore him or her silly. In the almost 40 years since, technology has given us unprecedented ways to not be bored. So rather than starting by talking about imagination, I wanted to ask you, how can we cultivate constructive boredom, both for ourselves and for young people, other than moving them to New Jersey?
You know, that's a difficult question, and I don't know that I have a good answer to it, but it worries me. It worries me because I don't think there are a lot of ways to be bored. There's so much stimulus in our society. These phones that everybody here in the audience has a little phone in your pocket, and computing knowledge on that phone and access to the world around you that's greater than entire libraries. You have more information in your pocket than the Library of Alexandria did, than the Smithsonian has. And how can you be bored? How can a kid be bored? The kids know these phones better than we do. But it is certainly true that boredom, which is perhaps an exaggerated way of saying it, but played a part in my own development as a writer. I mean, growing up in Bayonne, we had no money. We lived in the projects. My family did not even have the money to own a car. We never went anywhere. I lived on First Street. I went to school on Fifth Street. I lived in a world that was 5 blocks long. But it was reading comic books initially, and then science fiction books and fantasy books that took me to other places, that took me to Mars and to Venus and to the stars, and took me to the Middle Ages and to Middle Earth and the Hyborian Age and all of these wonderful realms of science fiction and fantasy, where I not only had adventures, but I began to imagine my own adventures. I mean, one of my earliest works, if you can call it a work, was an encyclopedia of space, which I still have. I showed it to Neil deGrasse Tyson when I did his show a while ago. And I must have been, I don't know, 6 years old when I wrote this thing. And it's one of those black and white speckly notebooks with pages. And I drew the planets, and, you know, I colored them in. I pointed out to Dr. Tyson Pluto, which he was not amused by. But I also threw in imaginary planets. Some of them I'd seen on shows like Rocky Jones Space Ranger and Flash Gordon that were on TV at the time, Mongo and so forth. But others were planets entirely of my own invention with names that included no vowels, and me making up the people who lived there. And my imagination was getting a workout there. I was already making up stuff at the age of 6. One of my earliest sets of toys were these spacemen, these aliens that you bought at Woolworths. They were 15 cents each. They were in a big bin. And there were a whole set of them. They were really great aliens, and I would buy them and bring them home. They broke very easily, though. They were fragile little aliens. But the thing about them is they were not from a movie. They were not from a television show. They were not from a comic book. It just said what planet they were from on the base, Pluto or Mercury or dark side of the moon. And each one was different from the others. And some were holding ray guns and some were holding other things. And I had to make up my own stories about who these people were. And I did. I decided they were a group of space pirates, and the Martian guy who had a really big green head, he was clearly the boss because he had a big head, he was smart. There was a little guy, a little yellow guy who, his base said he was from Orion, which of course, even at that age, I knew was a constellation and not a planet. But he was from Orion, and he was holding this weird device that didn't look like a ray gun, it looked like a drill. And I decided he must be the torturer who used that drill to drill into people's knees. And
I thought you were going to say he was mining the moon.
Yes, I was a very well-balanced little 7-year-old, or whatever I was. My point being, I don't think I would have made up all these stories or had that if these had been Star Wars figures, that coming all with a pre-digested story, and I already knew about them, and there was a comic book about them, and there was 6 movies about them, and there was a TV show about them. It was the fact that there was enough there to engage my imagination and put it to work, but not enough to fill up all the space, so I had to make up my own stories. And I think that's a great way to get kids going, to get them to making up stories. But is it possible in this age of mass media saturation, in this age of the internet and television with 350 channels and movies and comic books and podcasts and on and on and on, and new media coming every day, new people filling up everything? Is there still room for imagination? I hope there is, because ultimately we need, as much as I love Star Trek and Star Wars and Lord of the Rings, we need new stories. We need the new generation to make up their own stories. And for that, imagination is necessary.
I'm curious to know what role imagination plays in your life personally now, because of course you're professionally imaginative, but your work has also taken you all around a world that's much bigger than 5 blocks. So if it's no longer your sole means of travel, what role does imagination play for you personally?
I don't know if I'd call it imagination so much as the capacity to dream. But I did have that from an early age. I actually like Bayonne. I'm going back to Bayonne. I love New Jersey. It's got great things about it. I look at my childhood, and those 5 blocks are 5 pretty interesting blocks. I like to revisit them and think about them. But at the same time, when I was living there, I dreamed of the wider world and what it would be like. And I read about the Eiffel Tower for 30 years before I ever saw the Eiffel Tower. I still haven't seen the Great Wall of China, but I've read a lot about it. I hope to get there one day. And I dreamed that I would achieve something, get somewhere, experience the wider world. And indeed, as a kid, reading all that science fiction, including works by Sir Arthur, I dreamed of going into space. Before I wanted to be a writer, I wanted to be an astronaut. Except we didn't call them astronauts then. That was invented, by the way, for the Mercury 7. NASA invented that word. They thought it was more dignified. What we called them was spacemen. I wanted to be a spaceman. Some kids like cowboys, some kids like firemen. I wanted to be a spaceman when I was a little kid and go to these alien planets and do that. I also thought, I've mentioned many times that I grew up in the federal housing projects of Bayonne, low-income housing. Our family had no money. But on my mother's side of the family, we had money once. And my mother was always telling us these stories about her great-grandfather, who owned a very prosperous construction company, and he used to bring materials in by boat. And Bayonne was a peninsula, and he built his own dock, which was called Brady's Dock. She was a Brady. And Brady's Dock, oddly enough, was right across the street from the projects I grew up in. It was no longer called Brady's Dock. They'd lost all the money in the Depression. It was now a city dock, no longer owned by the family. And when I went to school, I walked up Lord Avenue, which took me past a house between 3rd and 4th Street where my mother had been born. It was her father's house, and she was the youngest of 11 children, and they'd all been born in that house, in a time when women had their children at home. They didn't go rushing off to hospitals. And she had grown up there. She had spent her childhood there. But of course, they'd lost that in the Depression, too. So I was very conscious from my mother's stories that even though we lived in poverty, and to a certain extent we were suffered a certain stigma that we were project kids, we weren't as good as the kids with other things, I had this sense of, I come from innate royalty. I come from something better. Maybe it inspired Daenerys Targaryen, who's always been told, even though she's fleeing from city to city, that she was the rightful heir to the Iron Throne, and that she was the blood of the dragon, and that she came from greatness. I never came from any sort of throne, but I at least came from moderately prosperous middle-classness. And I look on that, and when I consider some of the situations in the world today, and people trying to get out of poverty, people living in poverty, and that knowledge is something that I think we have to inculcate, that our education system has to inculcate in every kid. I was encouraged to dream, and I knew I could achieve it because it was in my blood, right? We've been somebody once, we've been something once in the world. But if you teach kids that they were never anything, and they're never going to be anything, then they're never going to dream about that. They're going to say, this is all I can ever be, and they're going to give up before they even started. You have to have that imagination. You have to be able to dream. You have to be able to dream of being whatever you want to be, and a spaceman, or the president of the United States, or the first president of the world, or the first man on Mars. Dream big, especially when you're a kid. That's crucial.
Well, one thing I think I've been wrestling with a little bit, and that I wanted to ask you about, is that fantasy and science fiction often operate in one of two modes. They can be inspirations, they can offer ideals for us to aspire to, or they can be warnings. And a lot of fantasy and science fiction is operating in warning mode right now, telling catastrophic stories about alien invasions or climate change. And it's absolutely true that we face substantial challenges as a society that we don't necessarily seem mobilized to meet. But do you think that there needs to be some sort of tilt back towards those ideals that fantasy and science fiction are sort of uniquely equipped to offer us? Do we need the ideals as much as we need the warnings?
Well, we do. We need to dream. And for me, the dream, some of our previous speakers touched on this, the dream of space was very central to me. It was almost a religious faith that I have, even though I'm not a religious person. But I had this faith in the science fiction writers, Arthur C. Clarke among them, but also, Isaac Asimov, Robert A. Heinlein, Cordwainer Smith, the list goes on, Clifford Simak, that we would go out to the planets, we would go to Mars and Venus, and eventually we would go out to the stars. And the human race would spread through the galaxy, and we'd meet, weird-ass aliens, and, be they Klingons or Kzinti or giant squid creatures or, you name it, but we would be there. And it frightens me when I listen to some of these prophecies about the near future and foretelling in the near future about the problems that we do face, that dream seems to be receding, and that people have given up on it. And I don't know what that says, but I don't think it's a good sign. I sponsor I sponsor fellowships to a number of writing workshops around the country, Clarion in San Diego and Clarion West in Seattle and Odyssey in New Hampshire and the Taos Toolbox in New Mexico. And each one of them has a different sort of requirements. I don't want to just duplicate myself. Each one is rewarding a full scholarship to a particular type of student. And one of them I call the Sense of Wonder Scholarship. And that one is particularly for the kind of science fiction that I wrote when I was writing science fiction and that I love best, which is stuff with aliens and distant planets 500 years in the future and starships, all of that, to my mind, great stuff. And of all the scholarships they offer, that's the one that we have the fewest applicants for. The young writers who are coming up are not writing that kind of stuff. They are all writing 20 years in the future, and the Earth is screwed. And dystopias, political oppression, climate change catastrophes, mass extinctions, warnings. And we certainly need the warnings because I see all of this stuff coming. But it is depressing that we're not getting the other side of the thing. We're not getting the dream anymore.
Is there something that the writers who do apply for that fellowship focused on wonder have in common, or something that distinguishes them from their peers other than their choice of subject material? I mean, I wonder if it takes a special kind of person or a special kind of vision to either have faith in that wonder or have the ability to inspire it in others.
I haven't really analyzed the applications enough to know if there's any commonality about that. It may be that the people who are still writing that stuff are people like me, who most of what I know about science I learned from science fiction, which is a heady brew, but not necessarily equal to our previous speaker with his extensive scientific knowledge. I visited the National Air and Space Museum yesterday. It was a wonderful visit. Any of you who haven't been there, please go and see it. It's partially closed now for renovations, but they still have incredible stuff there. The Spirit of St. Louis and Chuck Yeager's Bell X-1 and of course a lunar module lander, Neil Armstrong's spacesuit, the White Brothers flyer. I mean, God, it's all there if you love that kind of stuff. And one of the things they have there is the Mariner probe, which I think isn't often talked about enough. The Mariners landed on Mars and Venus, and they were crucial because they told us for the first time what Mars and Venus were really like. Right up until that moment in the 60s, and certainly in all of science fiction, we had these views of what Mars and Venus would be like, which was much more favorable for us. Mars, the air would be thin, it would be cold, but it would still be basically habitable, and we could have colonies on Mars, and it would be like living on top of Mount Everest there, but we could still kind of live there and do that. In Venus, it was covered with clouds. It would probably be wet and swampy. It would be like the Everglades or the Brazilian rainforest, and it would be dinosaurs and web-footed Venusians, and many great stories and great adventures were written on these worlds. My dear friend Roger Zelazny, who was sort of a mentor to me and one of the greatest science fiction writers who ever lived, he wrote A Rose for Ecclesiastes, his Mars story, and he wrote a Venus story, The Doors of His Face, The Lamps of His Mouth, and he wrote them right at that period where the Mariner probes were going out, because Roger said, I knew we were going to lose those planets, that when the reports came back, no one who wanted to write hard science fiction could write about these planets again. So I wrote the last Mars story and the last Venus story, and they're both classic stories that won major awards, but he was right after we knew what they're about. But think of what that meant for the space program, though. Once we lost Mars and Venus, I mean, we knew we weren't going to live on Mercury or Jupiter. We knew that going in here. So basically the whole solar system was rendered, no, we can't form colonies there. So where are we going to go? We have to go to the stars. But it's hard to get to the stars. They're a long way away. We invent these fantasies of hyperdrives and warp drives, and give it a name you want. I just called it in my stories the Star Drive, but they're fantasy. we don't really know you can warp space, or you can go to hyperdrive and everything whizzes past real fast, like when Han Solo steps on the gas. Generation ships, that was a great hope for getting us there. But there are hard science fiction writers today, like Neil Stephenson and Kim Stanley Robinson, both friends of mine, who say, well, that's a pipe dream too. The generation ship would never work. So how do we get to the stars? We can't even get to Mars and Venus. It's scary. So we really better make Earth work, because if we don't, maybe if we make Earth work and we stabilize things, we stabilize the population, we solve this climate change thing, we'll be better off. But other than that, I'm depressing everybody in the audience right now. I realize that was not my intent here, but it is kind of a scary thing out there, particularly for those of you who have kids. I mean, old farts like me may not be around to see where all these things end, but the kids and their kids certainly will be. So we've got to solve these problems. And there's part of me that's, when I contemplate this, undergoes a certain existential despair. When my wife Paris and I help support, not entirely, a wolf sanctuary down in southern New Mexico, the Wild Spirit Wolf Sanctuary. If any of you have any money and like wolves, as I do, send them some money. They always need it. They provide home for 54 wolves and wolf dogs that have need a sanctuary because they've been driven off their hunting grounds, or somebody raised them as pets and then abandoned them. But I became associated. I did some fundraising drives for them. I became associated with this place. And as a result of that, no good deed goes unpunished. And now I've heard from every wolf sanctuary in the world, which also wanks financial support. And I've also heard from the lion sanctuaries and the elephant sanctuaries and the tiger sanctuaries. And, you name it. There's sanctuaries for everything, which I didn't really realize until I got into this. And they send me these articles about how things are going, and it's all depressing. I mean, it's the kids who are, your kid, who's a little kid, may live to see a world that has no tigers in it, no elephants in it. I mean, human beings are just squeezing them all out. Maybe the ones in zoos will survive, except we have people want to shut down zoos. So maybe that's not the answer either. That's a horrible thing. I want our Earth to get its population under control, solve this climate change things, clean up the solution, and once in a have room not only for human beings to live full, rich lives where we enjoy our incredible culture, our history, but also to have room for elephants and tigers and wolves. Wolves are marvelous creatures.
Can I try to use your own words to cheer you up a little bit?
Okay, yeah, please do.
You gave this wonderful speech earlier in the year, and you said something that really stuck with me. You were describing this dream that animated a lot of your writing and a lot of your thinking earlier in your life. And I want to quote from it, because you said, "The dream was that all the races and nations of the world will come together in one world, one civilization that represents the best of all people, and that is what we will take out into the stars." And it struck me as a really interesting articulation of the sort of utopian vision of space, because it shifts from a sort of winner-take-all model where one version of culture, one idea of what it means to be human can be victorious, and instead it moves us to one where everyone has something to contribute and everyone has something that other people can see of value. And I was wondering how maybe this will lead us back in a pessimistic direction, for which I apologize. How do you think we help people see the potential of that sort of vision, where everyone wins and everyone has something to contribute, and step away from an existential struggle that seems to be dedicated to things that aren't in the end actually existential questions?
Yeah, I described that as the science fiction dream, and for me it was, because as a kid reading up and reading all these stories, we were going out to the stars, and we were meeting the squid monsters of Alpha Centauri and the giant three-headed aliens from Vega. We were meeting them as human beings. We were meeting them as representatives of the Federation or the United Planets or the Union, give it whatever it is, a united Earth. And the crew members would include members of various nationalities. It wouldn't be an American ship going out to meet them, and it wouldn't usually be a Brazilian ship or a Chinese ship or a Russian ship. It would be from the United Earth, and we're out there and we're meeting various alien races. And I absorbed that lesson just as a kid. And kids are very formative. They, what you absorb when you're young stays with you for your rest of your life. And I always assumed that is the way it would be. I knew it wasn't that way in the present day, but I saw signs that we were moving toward that. I, of course, like all the other kids of my generation, I was afraid of the Soviet Union and the specter of nuclear war. But fortunately, I was trained in case of an atomic bomb to hide under my desk. They were very good about training you to do that. But there were signs. I always responded to Woodrow Wilson and his dream of the League of Nations. We look back on it now with certain irony. World War I, it was a terrible, brutal war. In some ways, it was a war that fucked up Western civilization more than anything else, and a lot of the grief that's come since was because of that totally unnecessary and futile and bloody war. But when Wilson started talking about it should be the war to end wars, there was a great dream behind that, and there were a lot of other people who shared that dream, and they created the League of Nations from the noblest of purposes. Let's not have any more wars. Let's settle our differences, around a conference table like this and saying, well, I want this, well, I have to have this. Okay, can we compromise? Can we work it out? I respect you, you respect me. Let's work out our differences. Obviously, it didn't work. But then we tried again after World War II with the United Nations, supposedly an improved model of the League of Nations. I still think that's the way to go. I still believe, like many other Americans, I love Jefferson and Washington and the founders of the Constitution and all the monuments we have here in Washington, D.C. that have their words emblazoned on them, great words for the most case. But my favorite words as an American are the ones, not in any official document, but the ones on the base of the Statue of Liberty, the poem by Emma Lazarus. That's, to my mind, what America's ideal should be. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to be free. I lift my lamp behind the golden door. That's one of the best things about America. One of the things I'm proudest of is I'm descended from immigrants. You're descended from immigrants. Unless there's an Indian here somewhere, everybody in this audience is descended from immigrants. And shutting that golden door behind us and nailing it shut and talking about building walls is terrible to my mind. And it's a sign of something seriously gone wrong. And not just in the United States, as bad as it is, but I see that all around the world. I just got back from England where it's Brexit, Brexit, Brexit. We got to stop these people from coming in. In France, there's agitation about it. The Spanish don't like all the English who are moving down to the Casa de Sol and opening fish and chip shops. The Irish don't like the Poles who are coming over to work in construction. Everybody is afraid of everybody else. We're all human beings. That's my lesson here, and we should achieve that science fiction dream. That's our hope. If we all withdraw into our own tribes and build a bunch of walls between us and say, no, you can't come in, you're different than me, then we're not going to achieve that dream, and this whole planet is going to go down the tubes, maybe sooner rather than later.
I wanted to close by asking what you thought the role of imagination in public life should be, because I don't think it surprises anyone here that we face extraordinary challenges, but we're also facing a series of debates about whether art is political at all. So what do you see the role of artists in a time like this, and are there qualities that you think policymakers and politicians could stand to borrow from artists, particularly people who try to dream bigger than our conventional political discussions typically allow?
Well, I certainly think imagination is crucial for an artist, especially for a science fiction and fantasy writer. Clarke's imagination was pretty incredible, and all of the things he, like the beaver in that anecdote that was quoted earlier, he didn't build it, but it was his idea. That's great. The science fiction and fantasy traditionally has always had some interesting imaginative concepts around government and society and cultures and how they should work. Sometimes what gets me frustrated about the present political debates that we see is it seems to me that we're really lacking on new ideas. We're acting as if the present political and economic concepts, liberalism, conservatism, communism, socialism, fascism, as these are the only ones that are possible. Basically, these are all old ideas. We're still debating things that Franklin Roosevelt came up with for the New Deal, and some of them were old even then. Isn't there any new systems? Isn't there any new concepts? Surely an imaginative politician can come up with something. They might not all work. Some of them might be awful. You know, fascism was a new idea once. That one didn't work out too well. Marxism had some idealistic concepts to it, but in practice, it had very ugly concepts to it too. But who knows what? You know, I look at the science fiction books that I read, and you know, Philip K. Dick and Solar Lottery. He had the president chosen by a chance. You know, every citizen got a ticket for the lottery. If it said you're president, you were president. Maybe we should try that. We couldn't do any worse than what we have now. There've also some people have proposed, and we have the technology to do this now, a direct democracy, like Athens. I mean, we can take instant plebiscites on major questions. Do we really need representative government, or should we go to instant plebiscites? I'm not advocating this, mind you. I actually don't like that one because I know what happens on Twitter, and we'd all be voting for Socrates to drink the hemlock, just like the Greeks did if someone said something we didn't like.
Socrates is canceled.
But the point is there's room for new ideas in politics as well as technology in society. Imagination is always welcome. You can't build anything until you dream it first. So our society, arts, culture, politics, everything desperately needs more dreamers, more idealists. And I hope that some of these new generations coming up will include them.
Thank you so much, everyone. A round of applause for George R. R. Martin.
Thank you so much. Before you go too far, and please do go and sit down, we're going to ask that all of our awardees come back up here at the end with your awards so that we can have your photos, and also the intergenerational forum and everybody that's been involved in this. But so if you like, you can even wait on the stage and sit down. I want to thank everyone here. Thank our sponsors, and which are Google and Hughes. I want to thank our table hosts, Eutelsat, Flying Colors, the Hendricks family, Edward and Deborah Horowitz, Mintz, OneWeb, Random House, and myself. And also Joe Brovman, C-SPAN, and Michael Nelson for hosting and bringing in people at tables. I also want to thank our program committee, who is noted in our program. They help us enrich and build this program and reach out to so many of you. Our volunteers, it's bright in the house. They may not be here right now, may be volunteering, but thank you. They're also listed in the program. Our board, of course, and Constance Chatfield, who is running this whole thing, producing it, and Monica Morgan, who I'd like to have come out here, and Constance. Come on. Who year after year is responsible for making everything work for the Clarke Foundation, including this. I also want to thank Tor Books, because after this, all of you, regardless of which tickets you bought, are invited to go up the stairs for desserts and coffee. And Tor has given us many books that were written by this fine gentleman. Hi. And we invite you to take those books. And finally, those who were at dinner, we had an auction for the signed books, the centerpieces, and I'm going to quickly as possible read off who won that, because when you go up there, off to the side, you will see the money man, Tim Logue, sitting back there. I can't see you, Tim. There we go. He's in the back row waving, and he will take your money, and he will give you the centerpieces. And so the winners are Joe Brovman, right there on top, Maria Call, Mark Smith, Kathy Baer, Julie Quinn, Jonathan Baer, Josh Eisenberg, Jessica Noble, Dana Ratner, Ruth Pritchard Kelly, Eric Veery, Donna Ari, Mike Nelson, Roxanne Kerr, Allison Walisco, Jonathan Buring, and Stephanie Harbin. Congratulations to all of you. And can we give one more round of applause to our three amazing honorees? I challenge anybody to have a variety and intelligence and humor and fascination, like an evening like this one with these three people. And we hope we see you again next year after you've had dessert. So please. And can I get all of the program participants up here? Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you.